The Queen of the Fairies is sometimes named Queen Mab, depending on the source material. She's also known as the Queen of Elfland, the Queen of Elphame and Titania. But who exactly is Mab? Does she come from English folklore, or is Mab the name given by playwrights and poets to the Queen in folklore? Let's find out more about Queen Mab in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I have absolutely no idea if you're going to be able to hear the incessant rain in the background on this particular recording, but it's literally rained pretty much all day of the last 2 weeks, so never mind. I hope you enjoyed my previous 2 episodes in this series on King Arthur and Herne the Hunter, and this time we're going to be having a look a little bit more at literature because we're going to be having a look at Queen Mab. But before we do that, I just wanted to do my little bit. This episode is brought to you by mint, which in the Victorian language of flowers meant virtue, and I've got some apple mint growing at my back door, and it's weird because it's growing literally on concrete, like there's not actually any soil, but it's still growing, and I really do appreciate that level of tenacity on behalf of mint. But anyway, on with the episode. So like I say, we are looking at Queen Mab, and I do want to point out that I'm going to be focusing on English folklore in this post due to Mab's role in English literature. Scottish and Irish folklore also have their own distinct fairy monarchies, but they really do lie beyond the point of this episode because it doesn't really involve Mab. So if you do want to learn more about fairy queens and fairy monarchies, then as always, I recommend you check out the work of Morgan Daimler. But on to Mab. I did decide, even though I've just said we're focusing on England, to start off by actually hopping over to Scotland for a moment, because the Queen of the Fairies isn't a new idea when Mab pops up in literature, so we do need to kind of look at a couple of precedents before we can really look at Mab herself. And the Queen of the Fairies plays a central role in the legend of Thomas the Rhymer in the Borders, and obviously I do have a separate episode on him. And musicologists have traced the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer to the 13th century, so that does give us quite a long precedent for the concept of a Queen of the Fairies. Now here she's simply referred to as the Queen, and this gives us an established royal figure in the fairy world. And she grants Thomas the gift of prophecy when he serves his 7-year term as her servant. It is also worth noting as well that the Queen of the Fairies does appear during the Scottish witch trials because Alison Pearson claimed to be working for the Queen of Elphame, not the devil, and she'd been enlisted by the ghost of her dead cousin. And it's fascinating really because she said that she'd been brought to Elphame by her cousin to learn herbal medicine so that she could heal people, which is quite cool. So she learned herbal medicine from the fairies, and the Queen of the Fairies in this case really actually doesn't sound like a bad sort at all, because you think, well, it's just trying to teach a human how to do something. But obviously in the mind of those running the witch trials, the Queen of the Fairies therefore became linked with the diabolical. So I should point out she's not named as Mab at this point. So what about Mab? Well, our best records for Queen Mab as a named figure actually come from literature, especially from the late 16th and early 17th centuries, particularly William Shakespeare, so we're back to him again. But the big question is, did Shakespeare actually give the Queen of the Fairies her name, or was he using an existing folk name? Now, in some ways, I'm not actually sure it particularly matters, and it might be difficult to figure out which fairy lore comes from Shakespeare, and which fairy lore Shakespeare actually included, because you do have this problem in which you're not quite sure if he's repeating existing fairy beliefs or if the stuff that he mentions as being to do with fairies then appears in later fairy beliefs, so it's who influences who. For W.P. Reeves, he suspects that while Shakespeare had enough of an imagination to invent Mab's name, and I quote, "one can hardly escape the feeling that he borrowed the idea and the name as he did that of Titania," end quote. So I thought it would be worthwhile having a look at Mab's possible origins before we move on to Shakespeare, because Shakespeare then leads on to some of the other ones, and I think it'll just make sense structurally. But there is a theory that Mab is a shortened version of Dame Abonde, part of the French fairy court in the Middle Ages. William of Auvergne, Bishop of Paris, wrote of her that she was the leader of nocturnal ladies who gifted abundance to houses that they visited, Quite honestly, it's a massively tenuous link, and nobody ever really seems to massively want to put their cards on the table and go, yes, I believe this. It just gets repeated as a theory, but it's not a particularly good one if you ask me. Another theory references Mab as a version of Mav, described as an Irish fairy queen in ancient topography of Ireland by Beaufort. And then, of course, you end up with links to Maeve, Queen of Connaught, which also fall apart because their nature seems so very different. Now, Reeves actually notes the difference in pronunciation, obviously between Mab and Maeve, which again makes it unlikely that the two are linked. And Morgan Daimler also underscores the fact that the two figures have no connection. And this is such a massive problem. We normally see it with the Grimms, but it's a massive problem of people assuming that things must be the same because something sounds similar. That's not really how language necessarily works, particularly when it comes to different things having different pronunciations, even if they might look similar on paper. There was also another theory which also decided to rely on another language, which took the Welsh Maban for infant and then assumed that Mab was therefore a good name for a tiny figure, even a queen. And I saw that one repeated a couple of times, and again I'm like, I'm not sure, that doesn't really make much sense to me, but never mind. So on to Shakespeare, and he's the one who really popularises Mab as a figure. So he actually devotes an entire speech to her in Romeo and Juliet, sort of first published in 1597, although there is some dispute about whether it was an official version or not. Mercutio mentions her in a conversation with Romeo in Act 1, Scene 4, since he credits Mab with bringing Romeo his dreams. So Mab is basically cast as being the person who brings dreams appropriate to the dreamer. So lovers get dreams of love, courtiers dream of curtsies, lawyers straight dream on fees, which did tickle me quite a lot, soldiers dream of cutting foreign throats, and so on. So basically that sounds a bit rubbish that you're going to necessarily dream of what you do for a living. That sounds a bit poor. But Mercutio also discusses Mab's size and says that she's no bigger than an agate stone and she rides in an empty hazelnut as a chariot. Now, bits of the description do sound unbearably cute, but Mercutio does also accuse her of blistering ladies' lips if their breath is tainted with sweetmeats. However, Mab's diminutive size stands at odds with the human size of Titania, obviously the other queen of the fairies noted in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And Marjorie Swan notes that Shakespeare's inability to represent Mab on stage in Romeo and Juliet shows how far she actually was from fairies and folklore. And indeed, this is one of the things you do get with some of the folklore. You'll get reports where people have met fairies, but like they're human size, and people don't always necessarily know that they're fairies until after the encounter. So this idea of them being like tiny little twee creatures, again, Shakespeare, and then obviously the Victorians run with it. So it's something that's worth bearing in mind. Now, at the end of Mercutio's speech about Queen Mab, he also notes that she is, and I quote, "that very Mab that plats the manes of horses in the night," end quote. And his assertion that she, and I quote, "bakes the elf locks in foul sluttish hairs, which once untangled much misfortune bodes," end quote, references the belief that fairies or witches would borrow horses during the night and then ride them about the place. And then in doing so, they would create these either braids or knots in the horse's mane. And such braids were also known as witches' knots, fairy knots, and elf locks. And they were believed to be a sure sign that your horse had been hag-ridden during the night. Now, one simple way to avoid this happening was to hang a hold stone above your animals in their barn. There's various other ones as well, like having rowan present and stuff like that. But Mercutio also resurrects another form of hag riding because he notes the idea of Mab sitting on a dreaming woman, which again is a form of hag riding, notably captured by Fuseli as the nightmare. And it's this idea of essentially you're being pressed down by something really heavy, and you get it with sort of stories of sleep paralysis and things like that. But Roger Lancelin Green neatly draws this link between Mab as the bringer of dreams and the creator of nightmares. So I think in this case, Mab gets given a completely different set of things that she presides over than what we might assume from later folklore. Now, strangely, Shakespeare renamed the Queen of the Fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where she becomes Titania. And it's particularly strange because the plays were written in the same time period between 1594 and 1596. Although despite this, popular writers in the years after Shakespeare continued to name Mab as the queen, not Titania. And even as late as 1797, we find Queen Mab or the Fairies' Jubilee, which was composed for the marriage of Princess Charlotte. Now, playwright Ben Jonson also included Queen Mab as a major character in a play, which was called The Entertainment at Althorpe, also known as a particular entertainment of the Queen and Prince. And this was a masque performed in June 1603, specifically to welcome the Stuart royal family as they travelled from Edinburgh to London. Now, Mab appears on stage in conversation with a satyr, and she is described in the stage directions as the Queen of the Fairies. But despite this apparent royal status, the satyr addresses her as the mistress fairy that doth nightly rob the dairy. The satire also reveals Mab's ability to both help and hinder the churning of butter, and he notes her harsh treatment of country wenches, as they're called in the masque, pinching them if they don't clean properly. And if that wasn't enough, the satire also reveals that Queen Mab steals babies and leads midwives astray into ponds and other watery places at night. Now, interestingly, when Mab addresses Anne of Denmark at the end of the masque, she doesn't actually refute any of the satire's assertions, and instead she presents the Queen with a jewel. Now, isn't it interesting, though, that Johnson uses Mab rather than Titania? And he also follows what we would actually recognise from folklore as Mab's attributes, compared to Mercutio's casting of Mab as the bringer of dreams. And it would be fascinating to know if Johnson's version points to a more widespread understanding of Mab and fairies in the popular imagination. But obviously we'd have had stories with all kinds of fairy-like creatures, particularly things like the Headley Cow and various fairies that do a lot of shape-shifting, of leading people astray. You get this to a certain extent. And then, of course, there's the idea of the fairy changeling and things like that. So it's quite interesting how a lot of these ideas do chime more with what we would know from folklore than the stuff that Mercutio comes out with about Queen Mab being the bringer of dreams. And this is also then reflected later because fairies appear in various poems by Robert Herrick in his Hesperides collection of 1648. Yet number 556, just known as the Fairies, explicitly resurrects Mab as a warning to women. And he says, and I quote, "If we will with Mab find grace, set each platter in its place, rake the fire up and get water in ere sun be set, wash your pails and cleanse your dairies, sluts are loathsome to the fairies, sweep your house who doth not so, Mab will pinch her by the toe." Now, sluts here refers to slovenly or lazy women, not sexually promiscuous women, but it's still a horrible insult either way, because it's still drawing attention to you being a bad thing because of the fact you keep your house clean enough. And it's just kind of like, well, there's a broom, feel free to join in. Now, the poem might be short, but it is to the point, and it basically means keep your house clean and tidy, do all of your tasks, and you'll enjoy Mab's grace. Neglect your tasks, and Mab will pinch your toe. I mean, that sounds dreadful, obviously. But we should also note that the poem is so short we don't actually know what Mab's grace involves. And the whole poem also refers to the comment by the satyr in Johnson's masque, "The Queen Mab will pinch country wenches who don't clean satisfactorily." In some ways, it actually puts me in mind of the brownies rather than fairies, although, you could argue semantically they're all part of the same sort of grouping, with the fixation on tidying messy houses and messing up tidy ones. Yet here, rather than presiding over such household drudgery, Mab is ensuring the housewife does the tasks, not any of the fairy inhabitants of the home. And here, Mab's links with dreams seem all but forgotten. But Mab does appear in folklore, although perhaps less often than we might assume. People seem to encounter fairies in a general sense rather than fairy royalty, although that's not to say that tales don't exist in which Queen Mab does appear in all her glory. Now, I'm mostly focusing on a couple of tales from Northumberland, mostly because A, it's where I am, and B, it's because it was easier to find the records of this. But people apparently once believed that Queen Mab lived in Forden Hill near Whittingham in Northumberland with her court. And I did mention this in the Dancing Fairies of Northumberland episode. But just in case you haven't actually heard that one, according to this legend, fairies actually travelled from all over Britain to wait on Queen Mab at Forden Hill. And I'm going to be honest, it is quite nice having the idea of a centralised place of power being in the north rather than the south, but never mind. And in one particular legend, a farmer heard music coming from inside Forden Hill at midnight. When he got nearer, a door stood open in the hillside and he could see the fairy court enjoying a banquet. The fairies noticed him and sent a page out with a goblet, and then the farmer then dashed the drink to the ground and rode home. And this certainly echoes a very similar tale told of Willie Howe by Canon William of Newburgh, but the difference being that in this version the fairy queen is named as Mab, whereas in the Willie Howe version it's pretty much just a fairy court. Now, of course, we don't know at what point Mab's name was added to the story, whether it was a common part of the legend in Whittingham or whether James Service, who collected it, added it in reference to Shakespeare. And his retelling seems to be one of the earliest in print from 1834, so of course it's quite difficult to know at what point Mab was added and whether she was there originally. The same thing's also a problem that we have with a story related by M.A. Richardson, who also cites Queen Mab and her court as being responsible for a series of circular basins in the rocks of the riverbed by Rothley Mill in Northumberland, created for bathing purposes. And obviously I've got the episode on the Rothley Fairies as well. And that one comes from 1846. So again, you don't know if Richardson has collected this story and Mab has been present, or whether he's added Mab in order to give a name to the Queen of the Fairies. It's quite difficult to know. Elsewhere in the country, by 1849, being Mab-led had become a term in Warwickshire that described being led astray by a will-o'-the-wisp, and John Brand even makes a point that it's actually pronounced mob-led. Now, this certainly fits with the mischievous nature of Mab that is noted by both Ben Jonson and Robert Herrick, but it also links to the malevolence of some of her actions as well. And Ethel Rudkin collected a tale from Broughton village in Lincolnshire in which a depression near the west side of Ermine Street bore the name Maud Hole. Now, according to legend, Queen Maud, or as it should have been Empress Maud, successfully hid in the hole, and her ghost could be seen walking nearby every night at midnight, although it's not clear why her ghost would be wandering around in the street in the first place. Yet Rudkin also noted that in one of the accounts given of the same site, Queen Mab apparently walked in the area every night at midnight, and it's even more unclear as to why that would be, unless somebody had simply confused Maud and Mab over time. And this is basically where we have the problem with the folklore, the fact that, again, we don't know if somebody's just misheard something or if the name has been added after the fact of folklore that's been collected from someone else. So what actually happened to Queen Mab? Well, ultimately, I don't think Mab has ever actually fully gone away. Now, 19th century literature sort of replaces the fairy queen with the fairy godmother when you look at the fairy tale, although Mab and Titania obviously continue to exist in the works in which they'd already appeared, so they never really went anywhere. They continue to exist in those pieces. Although, having said that, as the vogue for fairies waned in folklore, which in some ways it is replaced by ghosts, tales start involving individual fairies rather than Mab. Fiction now largely seems to be Mab's domain, and she appears in a range of modern fiction, including Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files. And you knew I was going to mention this, Miranda Richardson played her in the Channel 4 series about Merlin. Now, in this particular retelling, because Mab's not really associated with the Arthurian legends, Mab schemed to get Merlin into a position of power to bring the people back to what she keeps calling the old ways, because without their belief in her, she would die. So she's quite self-serving in a lot of ways. She's not bringing people back to the old ways for their benefit, but rather for hers. But having said that, if people need to believe in Mab in order for her to continue, well, I can't help thinking that her appearance in literature pretty much means that she's more than likely to live forever. But I want to know what you think. Do you think that Queen Mab was always called that in the folklore and then Shakespeare just popularised the name? Do you think that he borrowed it from somewhere else? And do you think that the fairy population as a whole would have one queen, or do you think that they would have several ones in different areas? Let me know what you think. As always, you can always leave comments either below this on things like YouTube and I think Spotify, or indeed on the blog post that this episode is attached to. The link is in the show notes. Or you can always message me on social media and let me know what you think. It's always quite cool to hear people's theories and what have you as well. So that'll be good. Big thank you to the various people who have been buying me coffees and so on to show their appreciation for all of the legwork that goes into making the podcast. As always, it's much appreciated. But if you can't stretch to financially support the podcast, then you can just quite simply leave a review on whichever platform you use, because they really do help. And it's like an algorithm thing. It sort of helps show the algorithm that people actually like the podcast, so it's more likely to get recommended to others. Or you can just simply tell a friend, and that's always helpful as well. So either of those options are perfectly lovely. And I do quite like reading nice reviews as well. It does always make me smile. Anyway, next week we're going to finish off this particular theme of the month with Robin Hood. You can't really do fictional or possibly factual characters in the United Kingdom without focusing on Robin Hood, quite frankly. So we will be having a look at him as well next week. So I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.